Hi, I'm Alex Evans. I'm one of the founders, together with David Stephen, of the Long Crisis Network. And in this talk, I'm going to take us through the 4 long crisis scenarios that we were commissioned to do by Local Trust. Now, these are 4 stories about possible futures with COVID-19. They're not intended as predictions, and nor do we suggest that we're going to end up neatly in one of the 4 scenarios that we set out. Instead, they're a device, if you like, for teasing out uncertainties and possibilities, for helping us to imagine some of the different ways that COVID-19 might play out and what some of the key uncertainties are. The first of our 4 scenarios is a story called The Rise of the Oligarchs. And this is a scenario that's centralized and also polarized. In this story, it's all about government by the few and for the few. So what you find at the center here is very dense patronage networks that join together business, government, the media, and so on. This is a scenario that's illiberal, it's inequitable, it's opaque and corrupt, and above all, it's ineffective. It's not well geared up to dealing with the crises that are coming at us. Now, if you look at what's happening outside of those few people who have access to those patronage networks, the rest of us are involved in a kind of blame game. We're angry and scared, but we're also compliant. And so the result is a lot of apathy. It's an environment in which conspiracy theories can flourish very readily. And there's also a lot of racism and xenophobia in this scenario. Civil society here is really browbeaten and harassed. There's a steady closure of civic space. And communities are under real pressure. Regional disparities increase. Those communities that are able to access these patronage networks at the center are able to secure for themselves some of the spoils, but those that don't have access to those networks are left further and further behind. And when you look at the international level in this scenario, it's a very threatening outlook. There's lots of competition, lots of crisis. So that's the first scenario, Rise of the Oligarchs. The second one is called Big Mother, and that's a play on the idea of Big Brother in George Orwell's book 1984, but this is a much more benign version. In this story, which is the one that's centralized but also collective, government is back and it's here to help. It's well-intentioned. And one of the really defining features of this scenario is that expectations of the state soar, with government enthusiastically fanning those expectations. So people are looking to government to solve COVID-19, to ensure that they have a job, to guarantee their futures, and so on. And as a result of so many expectations converging around the state, everyone else is kind of elbowed aside in this scenario. So, this isn't a situation where there's much volunteering going on. People are looking to government to do it. Charities don't have much of a role. Instead, many of them become insolvent in this story. And as all of those expectations converge around government, the really big question in Big Mother is whether government has more right than wrong answers. If it does, then fine. But when it gets it wrong, when it's ineffective, anger surges as a result. Inequality goes down in this scenario, and the most vulnerable people in society find themselves better protected by generous benefit and welfare provision. But the broad mass of us don't have much influence or power in this scenario. Instead, power is very much concentrated among a small group of politicians and technocrats at the center. Local government in this scenario gets quite a lot more money, but not very much leeway in how to spend it. And another feature of this scenario is that it's pretty highly regulated and pretty tightly monitored. There's a lot of surveillance. It's quite a sort of constrictive environment, even if government is, as I say, basically well-intentioned. So that's the second story, Big Mother. The third one is a story called Fragile Resilient. And if you think back to the quadrants I described at the beginning, this is one that's distributed, but also very polarized. The backdrop to Fragile Resilient is wave after wave of COVID-19, and also a whole lot of other crashes as consequences of consequences kick in. So you can imagine a financial crash, a trade crash, a climate crash, a food or energy crash, and so on. And it's a bit like the closing stages of a game of Tetris, where the blocks are flying at you faster and faster. It's harder and harder to look ahead at what's coming at you, and eventually it all just falls apart. Now, the fragile part here is all about what's happening at global and especially national level. Government really doesn't have the capacity to solve all of these problems, all of these bricks that are coming at it in the game of Tetris. And so instead, what we end up with is national politics really as soap opera or as theatre. There's lots of drama, there's lots of noise, lots for the media to cover, people take sides and so forth, but not that much is really happening in terms of problem solving. Instead, it's at the grassroots in communities that the action is really happening. There's a tremendous amount of innovation at the local level in this story, but it's not the kind of innovation that takes us to a breakthrough that achieves transformational outcomes. Instead, it's innovation that's about coping, getting by, managing to stay afloat. And even though communities are fantastically inventive under all this pressure, we don't achieve a kind of strong outcome where we manage to really rise to the challenge and get past all of the crises coming at us. So as a result, society as a whole is quite a lot poorer in this scenario, even if some people, for example, organized crime, end up quite a lot richer. Above all, everything is more local in this scenario in the sense that horizons shrink. It's not local as part of a broader system that then aggregates to coherent action at national or global level. It just stays local in a very fragmented kind of way. There's not much learning happening, not much connecting the dots across communities. Fourth and finally, we have a scenario called winning ugly. And in the quadrants, this is the one that's both distributed and collective. Winning ugly is a strategy from tennis. It's the strategy that managed to defeat John McEnroe finally. And it's all about focusing on what works. It's not elegant, it's not pretty, but it does win. It does the job that it needs to do. In this scenario, there's no obvious moment of triumph. There's no moment like the end of Apollo 13, when everyone in mission control is applauding and patting each other on the back. But we do manage to get through the crises coming at us intact. Our institutions hold up. We come together. And in particular, what's happening here is that all of us are empowered to be part of the solution. That's what makes this a distributed response. There's a ton of learning going on here. There's lots of innovation. And there's also a focus above all on function rather than form. The question is, what's it going to take to get the job done rather than what would a perfect organogram or the most sort of logical approach to this look like? We think that there's an important role for narratives and stories in this scenario because shared narratives about where we are, how we got here, where we might be trying to get to, and underneath it all, who we are incredibly important in giving us that sense of shared awareness that enables a distributed approach to work, that makes us more than the sum of our parts. And as that happens, and as we kind of increase our bandwidth for dealing with the three layers of crisis that I described earlier on COVID-19, we also find that we have more bandwidth for dealing with other shared challenges, things like climate change. It's a very different kind of state in this scenario, both at central government and at local government level. This isn't the kind of state that we have in Big Mother, which wants to do everything itself. Instead, government is much more of a platform. It's there to help engineer collaboration and cooperation. It's there to help catalyze action. And it sees itself as a partner and a platform rather than the entity that's going to do everything on its own. And so one of the other things happening here is you get a real fusion of top-down and bottom-up. In this story, for instance, we imagine that the COVID mutual aid groups that have emerged in so many communities in recent weeks stick around as part of the solution, and local government welcomes that and works with them so that increasingly you have, as I say, this fusion of top-down and bottom-up. So that's winning ugly. It's not pretty, but it does work. We do win. We make it through to the other side in spite of some dents along the way. A final thought then about what's the story that emerges overall from the four scenarios as a set. And we think the really key uncertainty in all of this is whether we fragment into a them and us or instead come together into a larger us that's more than the sum of its parts, that's coherent and unified. And we think that there are really four things that can take us from that low resilience them and us to a high resilience larger us. One is about how risks and responsibilities are allocated. One of the things we see in some of the earlier scenarios is that risks are narrowly distributed on the most vulnerable people in society. But what happens in Winning Ugly is that risks are much more equitably shared. It's the same with responsibilities, that situation where everyone is empowered to be part of the solution. Another thing that's a defining feature of a larger us is that theme of foresight that I touched on a couple of times with the scenarios, that we're able to look ahead and plan and strategize. We're not just firefighting on the immediate stuff that kind of blocks right in front of us in the game of Tetris. The third thing that really counts here is whether we have shared awareness, a shared sense, like with that story theme that I talked about in Winning Ugly, about whether we have a common sense of where we are, how we got here, where we're trying to get to, what are the values that really underpin our action. That's what we mean by shared awareness. And then fourth and finally, the importance of shared platforms, the sorts of connective tissue, if you like, that allow a distributed approach to work. Because it's those shared platforms that take all of that great local innovation that's happening in Fragile Resilient and actually aggregate it so that it's not just happening at local level, but it's aggregating to regional and national and ultimately global level. So we have the really partnership-based approach to solving problems. So that's a quick trot through some of the background, some of the uncertainties that are playing out with COVID-19 and those three layers of crisis that I mentioned, the four scenarios that we use to imagine different ways that this could play out in the future. And then finally, this key theme of a them and us versus a larger us, and some of the factors that can take us through into a larger us. Hope you enjoyed listening to the talk. If you're interested in finding out more, there's lots more on longcrisis.org/scenarios. You can also sign up there for our newsletter, and do also check out some of the blog posts we've got running this week on globaldashboard.org, our blog, where we're running a week of responses to the long crisis scenarios. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to hear your feedback.